think of anything more important to talk about these days than the Constitution. Lewis breezed through 4 years at Stanford earning a degree in math and 2 years at the University of Southern California earning an MBA. After college, he served over 4 years as a captain in the United States Air Force stationed in Texas. From there, he pursued what became a 30-year career in computer systems designing and programming, and 8 years as owner of a computer service company in Louisville, Kentucky. Lewis retired in 2001 and says that he was enormously enjoying the 200 rounds of golf that he was playing every year. And I think you also were in some tournaments, weren't you, Lewis?
Quite a few.
Yeah, quite a few tournaments. But he, for some reason, known only to his inner child, he says, he felt a calling to write 2 books and rejoin the misery of doing actual work by becoming an author. He says that he came to a political awakening late in life, primarily because he kept asking himself, this wasn't done in the past, so why are we doing this now? He therefore decided to try to discover what was behind the frivolity at the federal level. He discovered that the federal government had been infected with a cancer. Because he couldn't go to Washington and give the elected officials a chemotherapy or radiation treatment, he decided perhaps his books were the best thing. One of his books is titled Presidential Diary, which chronicles the life of a future president taking the reins after disastrous years under the control of a socialist learning progressive. Does that sound familiar? Once he realized his books were not making the impression he desired, he decided to start the United States Freedom Army, which is dedicated to constitutional resurrection. This enormous effort with people enlisted in all 50 states occupies the majority of his time at present. And we're so happy to have you, Lewis, this evening to really tell us a lot about our Constitution and how it's being ripped apart.
Constitutional law, your name
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Norm told me to make this longer because I'm the only speaker tonight. So if I stall a little bit and chuck and jive a little bit, you'll know why I'm doing it. I was going to give you the short course, but I guess you're going to get the medium course tonight. She gave me a nice introduction. I'm the author of these 2 books. And they're about a fictional president that takes over in the year 2020 after 8 years of Obama and 4 years of another fictional president who was just as bad as Obama. So you can imagine what he had to deal with. I gave you a handout, and what I wanted to talk about tonight was the first item on the handout, which is limited power. This is probably the area that has been the most abused in the U.S. Constitution, and I wanted to go through it with you tonight and discuss the reasons why we're where we are. Before I get started, I'd like to ask a few questions just to make a point. Who wrote the Constitution of the United States? In 1787, James Madison wrote the Constitution of the United States. Who wrote the Bill of Rights? In 1791, James Madison wrote the Bill of Rights. Who are the 2 principal writers of the Federalist Papers? Those are the papers that explain the Constitution. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Is anybody noticing a trend here? That's why James Madison is called the father of the Constitution. Now, for me personally, When James Madison says this is what the Constitution means, for me, that's what it means. I don't listen to John Roberts or Elena Kagan or Hugo Black or any of these other people if they're contradicting Mr. Madison. So that's who I go to when I want to know what these things mean. And I will bring that in later as we get further into this and tell you what he had to say about some things. Limited government. The limited government is, it's kind of hard for me to do this, but I'll do it. The limited government is enumerated in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. These are called the enumerated powers. They specify what the Congress may do, and by implication, what the federal government may do. And I'm going to read them to you tonight. It would help. I think I can see it all right. But I'm going to read them to you, and everybody's groaning. God, we're going to be here all night. He's going to read the Constitution to us. And no, actually, it doesn't take very long. There aren't very many. And I'm going to read them to you one at a time, and I'm going to comment on some of them. Here we go. Enumerated powers, Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. Number 1, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. They can tax you. Notice the term general welfare. Make a mental note of that term. We're going to talk about that later in some detail. It's also in the preamble to the Constitution, the term general welfare. We're going to go into that because it's important to know how this has been abused. Another interesting point about number 1 is that the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, and imposts. Taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, but all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. It doesn't say all taxes shall be uniform throughout the United States. You can use this to make an argument that the 16th Amendment was not required. 16th Amendment's the income tax amendment. 2, to borrow on the credit of the United States. They can borrow money. They're doing an excellent job. Believe me. They've got this one covered.
How much are we borrowing?
Too much.
$1 million a minute.
There you go. Number 3, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. This is the Commerce Clause. Make a note of that one also. We're going to talk about the part that says to regulate commerce among the several states. Another part that's been massively abused. Number 4, to establish a uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States. The Congress has the authority to make immigration laws, and that only makes sense. You can't have every state having their own immigration laws. They also can regulate bankruptcies. Number 5, to coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. To coin money, what does that mean? It means that money should be backed by an object, a metal such as gold or silver. We haven't done that for a long time. And as a point of interest, every single piece of paper money in your wallet is unconstitutional unless unless it was printed before 1933, in which case it says redeemable in gold. Number six, excuse me, to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. Number seven, to establish post offices and post roads. They can have a post office. It's not doing very well financially, but they can have one. Number eight, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. They can control copyrights and patents. Number nine, to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. You can have federal courts, federal district courts, and so forth. They're allowed to do that. Number 10, to...
They don't work. Sorry.
I'm seeing it okay, it's kind of tricky. Number 10, to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. Anybody remember the Somali pirates? We could have gone down there and taken care of them. But you know who did? Russia. They sent a warship down there and bombed them, and that was the end of that deal. Which is, I think, is kind of embarrassing for the U.S. But,
We've had a lot of that lately.
apparently there are Muslims that were running the piracies, maybe. I don't know. Anyway.
Surprise, surprise.
11, to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Number 12, to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. 13, to provide and maintain a navy. 14, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. So you can have a military, and by implication, you can give the military benefits. 15, to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. 16, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. 15 and 16 mean that states can have a militia and they can be called together. 17. This is a long one. To exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may, by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of the government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. This is about the Bundy Ranch matter. This is referred to as the enclave clause. And what are they saying here? They're saying if you have land within a state, you've got to put on a fort, a magazine, an arsenal, a dockyard, or other needful buildings. Owning and managing raw land within a state is not permitted, according to this right here. I don't know what Mr. Bundy's motivations are, but I think part of it is he's trying to make a constitutional point, that he thinks he should be paying his money to the state of Nevada. And number 18, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. This is what's known as the necessary and proper clause. In other words, to do these things I just mentioned, you can write laws to support them. And that's it. That's what the federal government can do. Now, there are some other things in other parts of the Constitution that they can do, but basically this is it. And this is what they're allowed to do. And what happens if it doesn't fall under here? The 10th Amendment covers it. That is the corollary to this section of the Constitution. It says that if it's not delineated here, it falls to the states or to the people respectively. So you have a group of things that the government can do, and you have a remedy when it's not specified. Excuse me, not specified. I want to get back and talk about the Welfare and Commerce Clause a little bit. The people on the left use these two items to get around the Constitution's limiting powers.
Right.
They use the Welfare Clause to deal with people, and they use the Commerce Clause to deal with businesses. And they use them as a catch-all. And that's not what was intended. Let me talk about the Welfare Clause a little bit. By the way, Norm told me to stretch this out, so you're going to hear a little more than you might have if Ron had been here.
You're not supposed to tell them that.
It's all right. Go for it.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
You know what, if I'm going to break you just for a moment. Nobody knows the Constitution. Nobody does. I know the gentleman over here does, and I think Kaplan does, and his wife, but very few other people in the room do.
Most people in the United States think the federal government can do whatever they want.
Yeah. Well,
That's
because
the way they think, because that's the way they've been taught to think. And that's the most abused part of the Constitution, and that's the reason for it's going down the tubes. They don't follow the rules. Let me get back to the Welfare Clause here for a minute. What did James Madison say about the Welfare Clause? And also Thomas Jefferson and many others. And I'm going to summarize for you what they said. They said, just because we told you to provide for the general welfare does not mean you can have any powers not already given to you. In other words, you cannot use the Welfare Clause as an excuse to exceed the enumerated powers of the Constitution. Now, that's exactly the opposite of what they are doing right now. And this is how they get into your business. They say, gee, well, we're going to pass a bill about, say, food stamps. And they say, well, what's your justification for that? Oh, we're providing for the general welfare. Won't fly with James Madison, and it won't fly with me. Commerce Clause. This is how they invade businesses. They say, oh, we're regulating commerce among the several states. Well, what did James Madison say about the Commerce Clause? He said, the several states portion of the Commerce Clause does not stand on the same level as the foreign commerce portion of the Commerce Clause. In other words, it was put in there for one reason and one reason only. And that reason was so that the federal government could control the states if the states interfere in interstate commerce. That's the only reason it was put in the Constitution. And yet, they use that as a catch-all to get around the restrictions that were placed by the founders on the Commerce Clause. And you can look this up on the Commerce Clause. It's James Madison's letter to Joseph Cabell, and also if you want to look it up, you can look in Mark Levin, the Liberty Amendments. I think it's chapter 7 or chapter 9. He takes you right to where in the Federalist Papers they said the same thing. did this all come to pass? Well, I'm going to give you a little history of the Roosevelt administration. And Franklin Roosevelt destroyed the concept of limiting power. And he did it because in effect he was a dictator. When he came in 1933, his party controlled both houses of Congress, but he didn't control the courts. There were 4 conservatives, 4 liberals, and 1 swing vote in the Supreme Court. And they started throwing his stuff out, and he didn't like it. So what did he do? He got the court packed. By 1937, the end of 1937, Roosevelt had appointed 7 of the 9 justices. And the other one was a liberal, and he promoted him to Chief Justice. So what did you have in the court? You had 8 liberals, you had a swing vote, and that swing vote, he caved. And in came all these court cases. So they challenged this. They came in and they challenged the Social Security Act, and because of the welfare clause. And of course, they found that in effect they changed the meaning of the welfare clause. They changed it from what the founders intended to what it is today, which is a catch-all. In effect, they just destroyed the meaning of the welfare clause. And then later they did the same thing with the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause case was Wickard versus Filburn, and the welfare clause case, there were several cases, but the main one was Helbring versus Davis. And if you buy the book, I have a book at home of the 10 worst Supreme Court decisions of all time. Those were number 1 and number 2 in the book. So what happened? We lost our limiting power. We lost our ability to control the federal government. Now, when I read to you the enumerated powers, did you hear me say anything about schools, federal minimum wage, student loans, food stamps, unemployment benefits, health care? I didn't hear any of that in there. And that's because they're not supposed to be in there. In fact, probably 80 to 90% of the matters the federal government is involved in are unconstitutional. Now, why did the founders limit the federal government functions? Well, it was pretty simple. They realized that too much centralized political power leads to dictatorship. And we're working on one right now. Yep. And if he can get his term, if he can get a 3rd term, he'll take it. Yep. But they said in effect that we just got rid of 1 king, and we don't want another one. Now, what are some of the remedies here? I'm going to give you a few quotes from John Marshall, who was a pretty famous Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Well, first was John Jay. 1803, Marbury versus Madison, and I'm paraphrasing. He said, "A law that is repugnant to the Constitution is void." I don't know what the Affordable Care Act is, but if anything ever fit the definition of repugnant, that's it. In 1819, John Marshall said, in McCulloch versus Maryland, and I'm paraphrasing again, "Whenever Congress passes laws in areas where they are not constitutionally permitted, that law is not the law of the land." Remember Harry Reid running around after the Supreme Court decision saying, "Oh, it's the law of the land, it's the law of the land." Now, a president could, theoretically, go in, since he's taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution, and say, this law is not constitutional and I won't enforce it. And he would be on solid ground. So let's just take one. No Child Left Behind Act. The president could take, he'd have to have a certain amount of backbone, which we don't seem to see lately, but he'd have to go in.
Ted Cruz.
He'd have to go in, he could go in and say, the No Child Left Behind Act is unconstitutional and I'm not going to enforce it. And he would be on solid ground. There's nothing, other than for discrimination, there's no way that the states can really get involved in school, or the government can really get involved in schools.
Isn't that exactly what Obama did with the Defense of Marriage Act? He said, I think that's unconstitutional, and therefore we will not enforce it.
He may have done that, I don't know.
Oh, he did? Absolutely.
I want to talk about a president few of you have ever heard of, but he's one of my favorites. Grover Cleveland. When Grover Cleveland was president, he would veto laws regularly because he told the Congress, you have no authority to be in here, this is unconstitutional. And he did it all the time. And eventually, I think the Congress got the message. They started to read the Constitution before they sent him something. Grover Cleveland was the king of the veto. And he vetoed it because of the very reason I told you. And we need a few Grover Clevelands today. We're not getting them. I want to talk a little bit about how the federal government should be operating. As you all know, the states created the federal government. It was not the other way around. So I like to look at it as the states are the parents, and the federal government is the child. And in the enumerated powers I just read to you, it's like the parents telling the child, you can do this and this and this and this and this, and that's all. Otherwise, you got to come to me and get permission. And that's sort of the way this thing is supposed to operate. You can do the things we enumerated, but then you have to get permission. But the child doesn't get permission anymore. And you know what happens when the child is running the household? You got problems.
Chaos.
And this is what we have, and this is what we're dealing with. Now, the way it should work is if the child does not have permission, or the federal government in this case, they need to go to the parents. And they do that by amendment. They need to take an amendment to the states and say, we want permission to do such and such. And I'll give you an example. It's one I use all the time. The FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. Now, if they'd been doing it correctly, they would have gone to the states and said, we want the authority to regulate aircraft. It makes sense that they should have this authority. You can't have a bunch of people standing on state lines trying to figure out which state this plane is in. So it makes sense. But the fact remains they didn't do that. They just took the authority. So technically, the FAA is an organization that's unconstitutional, and basically almost every organization in the federal government is unconstitutional because they didn't ask for permission. Now let me give you an example of how you get in trouble with this. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, may be something that the federal government needs to be doing. But they didn't ask permission. They just did it. So now what do you have? Well, you have a federal government that says that marijuana is illegal, and you have state governments that are saying it's not illegal, you got problems. Because nobody knows who's in charge here. Well, technically, according to this, the states are. But that's true of a lot of things. Technically, they can go tell the federal government to take a hike. And in this case, they're doing it. Is that enough? Or should I go on?
Stop now, you're on a roll.
We're going to have questions when I'm finished.
Yeah, let's, let me just interrupt. Please ask the questions when you do his presentation, please. Okay? Thank you.
Yeah. The thing about the parent-child relationship is sometimes children will do things that are good, but they still should ask permission. The FAA was probably good, but what happens is when they do something that's good and don't ask permission, pretty soon they're going to do something that's bad without asking permission. And that's when you're going to have problems, because pretty soon they're going to figure out, I don't have to ask permission. I'm just going to do it. And that's what's happening here. I'm going to close with this, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. But if you don't take away anything else from tonight, I want you to remember this. Judicial precedent does not trump the Constitution itself. The courts cannot issue rulings that contradict the Constitution. The Constitution determines the meaning of the Constitution, not the courts. Don't forget that. Because the courts often issue rulings that contradict the Constitution. And I'd like to stand here and tell you some of them, but you know, we might be here till 4 in the morning or something. Let me just give you one though, since I've got a little extra time, let me just give you one that's one of my favorites, and it's a big one. Roe v. Wade. At the time Roe v. Wade was settled, there was only one conservative on the Supreme Court, and that was William Rehnquist. And it was settled in a 7-2 vote. Rehnquist actually got